Good morning, and welcome to Judging by the Cover, where we are going to go ahead and take another look at a game that we have not played. I haven't played this. In fact, I do have some exposure to the franchise that we're looking at today. Not because I've played any of the games, but Five Nights at Freddy's has been notorious being for having deep dives and lore and let's plays all over the internet for the past like like a decade, I think, by now. Okay, my brain might be hitting the timeline a little off, but it feels like it's been a long time with lots of games from Scott Cawthon ever since the original Five Nights at Freddy's, which was a cultural storm when it started to hit and started releasing games like back to back to back to back. And from the game series that he was producing, they seem to have a little bit of a minimalist design to it, but with so much packed in that is what drew people in. On top of the deep dives of the lore and the horror motif of Chuck E. Cheese style animatronics haunted by the souls of dead children from a serial murder situation. At least that's what I've gathered from the slew of game theory videos that had come out from that. But, that's just a theory, a game theory. I'm not gonna apologize for that. That the joke was right there. It was low hanging fruit, and I am just gonna own that. Anyway, this is judging by the cover, not game theory, where we are going to be looking not necessarily at the lore, but at what the store page is showing us for Five Nights at Freddy's Secret of the Mimic. By the way, happy late Halloween. I know it's a couple days after, but it's so close. I just figured, you know what? We got a recommendation for this. We can fit one more horror game in for this year. So this time we are looking at Five Nights at Freddy's Secret of the Mimic. Now, just as a little bit of background, like I said, I have seen a fair number of the game theory videos some years ago, but since then I have not kept up with the franchise as a whole. I know there are several books out. There are books that I think are supposed to be considered canonical. I had recently found The Silver Eyes, which I think is supposed to dive into the lore of the franchise itself. But then there's also the Fazbear Frights books, which I found on sale at a discount store in a box set that I've gone through some of them, and some of them seem where they're hit or miss on how tied to they are to the canonical Five Nights universe, whereas other ones seem a little disconnected or Five Nights adjacent, but still have the similar theme of haunted animatronics, ghost story kind of things, kind of along the lines of Goosebumps for anybody familiar with that franchise, because that was another, multi dozens and dozens of books that was like children's horror books or spooky books for kids with that kind of vibe. But that's the kind of tone that it gives. Now, the Five Nights at Freddy's Secret of the Mimic, from what I'm seeing in the trailer, looks to maybe deviate a little bit from the haunted portion of it. Maybe there is still a haunted situation going on. The trailer does tell us that you're basically raiding what seems like a research facility, somebody's derelict laboratory where their inventions are basically left to ruin, and you are being sent by something. You know what? Let's just get right into the description of it. So the store is telling us. Enter the abandoned workshop of Murray's Costume Manor and unravel the mystery left behind by the reclusive inventor, Edwin Murray. Uh, me being having been out of the franchise lore for a while, for several years actually, and this is one of the reasons why I haven't really tackled Five Nights games yet, because I have had exposure to a lot of the older games. This one, this one wasn't even on my radar. I hadn't even heard of this one until it was mentioned to me in a Twitch stream by somebody giving a recommendation. In Five Nights at Freddy's Secret of the Mimic, you'll step into a world where every dark corner holds a secret and every flicker of light hints at an ever present threat. The Mimic, a prototype endoskeleton, can adapt to any costume and become any character, including what you fear most. Armed with only your wits, a few gadgets, and a heavily redacted corporate briefing, you will attempt to retrieve Fazbear's prized prototype technology while grappling with cryptic clues and a relentless shadow determined to dispatch all unwanted company. Prepare for heart pounding thrills as you explore the labyrinth of the deserted costume manor, discovering remnants of Edwin's unfinished work and eluding the monster he's created. Five Nights at Freddy's, Secret of the Mimic, and survive the. Oh, experience the Secret of the Mimic and survive the mystery and madness. Okay, so this is a. It will be available June 13th, 2025, which, well, that's pretty well long and gone by now. Also, disclaimer: Fazbear Entertainment is not responsible for whatever you awaken in the dark. So they're definitely leaning into the horror motif that Five Nights is known for, but it seems like they. I don't know how far the franchise in total over the last few years has deviated from the whole haunted animatronics, murder cases, and revenge ghosts that had built it up, but Secret of the Mimic does seem to maybe deviate from that and go into, like, it feels like you're stepping into a madman's research lab or a madman's leftover unfinished projects that have like this notorious air to it. I'm kind of getting the vibes of like the Half-Life Black Mesa compound, where you're basically trying to fight your way out of a government facility. Although this one is less about the government, like you're more like going in to retrieve something. Maybe also along the lines of Bendy and the Ink Machine, where you're unraveling the mystery, but you're not a current employee or something. And that's one of the things that the older Five Nights games have is you're a new employee, or you're a kid who's sick at home or something and experiencing like some kind of ghost situation in your bedroom. Those seem to be the vibes that the older games give. This one has you actually exploring a a research facility or a laboratory left over by one of the other. I'm guessing that the Edwin Murray is one of the big names within the Five Nights franchise, especially considering that there are some of the games that have you going through research facilities and stuff like that, or not, or storage situations to uncover other animatronics and other stories and other ghosts and other parts of the lore. This one, I don't know, it feels more like a monster story. Like I said, like the Bendy and the Ink Machine, or maybe even Slender, or oh gosh, what was one of those other horror games with a monster that you had to evade, where it was one of those? If the monster is, possessing different things and hitting and hiding out in different locations, a la Alien or something like that, where it's crawling through the air ducts, and if you see it, it's basically, it's hunting you kind of situation. It, I don't know, it feels more like it's a deviation from the spooky haunted animatronic and more of like a hunter monster kind of situation. The screenshots are showing us at least the atmosphere. We do see, workbench, laboratory, some different characters and animatronics. Of course, Fazbear being your Chuck E. Cheese pizzeria, they have a lot more different characters than than the Chuck E. Cheese cast, clearly. But here we see that maybe the laboratory had a whole bunch of extra costumes that may have never made it into circulation. That is one of the interesting motifs here, where if you're working in somebody's abandoned lab, or you're trying to uncover things in somebody's abandoned lab, there's probably a lot of unfinished projects and unfinished characters that maybe never even saw the light of day. So I could see how that would make sense. We have an elephant character and a clown outfit here. We have other. Oh wow, yeah, that is a hideous looking monstrosity. Like I can't even make heads or tails of this. Like it's an upside down. Oh, okay, I see. It's an upside down face with a top hat is what we're looking at here. Whether or not the endoskeleton that is the mimic is in there, I have no idea. It looks like we do have some shot of what I'm assuming is the mimic. Now, something else what was it? There was another one of the animatronics from one of the older games. It had a name, but the name is escaping me. I'm wondering if the mimic is like maybe a prototype of uh gosh, it was something in one of the games. I think the ending of the game was something along the lines of like uh the machine would scoop the victim out so that the skeleton could insert itself into the human's body and then basically masquerade around in the living world at like basically replacing the person while wearing the human's body as a skin. I don't know if maybe the mimic is that same creature, but it does seem kind of like that might be the case, considering the mimic can go into any suit, uh, depending on what the goals of the mimic are. If it has goals, that's another thing is dealing with the mystery. But as far as the store page is going, it at least seems like, they're not trying to reveal too much. They tell you there's a mimic, they tell you that it can possess anything, but they're not telling you anything about the goal of the mimic. Now, if you're more versed in the lore and the history of the franchise, you might have a better idea already going in. But from me being on the outside, having been removed from this for years and having played none of the other games myself, we have a whole little computer panel going on. There's even oh wow, an actual display of a gator and hippo, and a bunch of frogs just doing their country bear jamboree style, Chuck E. Cheese music show. Now, it's a little hard for me to pin down exactly the score for this. It does seem like shortly after it came out, there was some hot fixes and some patches that came out, which modern games can come out with some bugs once they hit the thing, and because when it comes to playtesting as well, especially from an indie developer, there's probably only so much playtesting a single a single studio can do. And then once something hits the larger market, that's when they can get more bug reports from the user base, because with millions and millions of active players, they're probably going to uncover more than what 3 4 5 even 10 or 20 people could in playtesting. So bug fixes came out pretty quickly on the thing. There's have been updates since then. So overall, it's hard to pin down exactly what I think I would rate this. I think because of the change in the tone, I may be putting this down at about a 5. I'm getting very much less of the haunted animatronic and ghost story vibe, and like I said, more of that like Bendy and the Ink Machine or Alien or Half-Life Black Mesa Compound, uh monster outbreak stories. It feels more like a kind of corporate tech hunt situation than a haunted thing. Now, that it's not to detract from the atmosphere and the horror of the game, because those things are certainly still present. They lean heavily into the atmosphere, but it does seem more like your adventuring puzzle game through the compound, as opposed to your minimal. They seem to have abandoned the minimalist design factor that Five Nights was built on, and I'm not sure if that might be something that just kind of leaves me with some mixed feelings here. Again, as somebody who has not played Five Nights at Freddy's at all, my exposure has been game theory and let's play videos those years ago when the games were first starting to roll out. But it seems like they lean into the atmosphere but have abandoned the source, so to speak. It looks like it could be an interesting game, but I don't know that it doesn't strike me as a Five Nights at Freddy's brand outside of more than the skinning of it. If maybe it had been given a different coat of paint, a new IP, that might be more of a selling point for me if they sold it as from the makers of Five Nights at Freddy's instead of a new Five Nights at Freddy's game. That way they could go ahead and craft a new universe, new lore that focuses more on the company researching this abandoned tech. Although how that might translate into sales or player interest, I'm not quite sure about that either, because players can be fickle with brand loyalty. But at the very least, I think I would have viewed this more favorably if, like I said, it was sold as from the makers of Five Nights as opposed to being a Five Nights game, especially if they've abandoned the multi-day format of the franchise, where part of the appeal of it was you're playing a progress, like a difficulty progression, where each of the 5 nights of the game gets progressively harder. This one seems like I keep making the comparison to Half-Life, where as you go, obviously it's going to get more difficult, but it seems more like you're jumping into a single mission as opposed to, showing up for work for 5 days or something. Uh, I th- there's just some directions they could have gone to maybe tweak this and make it a new IP. Just make it very clear that it is from the same creator. The way, um, like how Square Enix is known for Final Fantasy, but then they do have other newer titles like the Bravely Default that came out, where it's like, oh yeah, from the makers of Final Fantasy, here's Bravely Default if you like that kind of like classic turn-based RPG format. But it is a new franchise, even though although to be fair, Bravely Default, the at least the first one on the 3DS, did feel very much like Final Fantasy V, mechanically speaking. But I just think they could have done a bit with a different coat of paint, a different skin, even if they don't, even if it was the exact same game, the same visuals and everything. Um, if they left out the Freddy's branding, I think it would have, like I said, it would just be more interesting. So I'm going to give this a 5 out of 10. It looks like a decent horror game. In fact, oh, what was even the price point on this? Oh, you know what? I actually didn't even look at the price. $40? Okay, 40 what coming from a franchise that was known for like $5 to $10 minimalist games. You know what? I'm going to have to bump this down to a 4 because like I said, the game looks interesting, but for $40, uh with the history of the studio, I'm even more skeptical about that. So you know what? If it wasn't for the $40 price tag, I would say a 5 out of 10 on my chance at looking at this if I was into horror games like that. But with the $40 price tag, I'm gonna have to bump it down to a 4. This thing would have to go on a major sale for me to want to look at it. Now, I'm not a huge horror game connoisseur myself, but I do like at least having a look at games and seeing how things, like seeing the interest behind things, so that I can maybe appreciate the structure and the narrative that they do put out, because there is an art form to this. It just seems like, though, it feels like they're riding very much on the coattails of the franchise popularity to the point that, ah, I don't know, the $40 price tag on a Five Nights brand thing just kind of rubs me the wrong way. But again, maybe I would look at it more favorably, like keep saying, if it was a new IP from the creators and they just leaned into making it its own thing, giving it its own identity as a corporate research, or like, abandoned research facility gone wrong situation, as opposed to having to make it about the bear and the franchise that's rooted on the vengeance of ghosts. This one just it feels more like an Ultron situation, the technology going rogue, than it does the original Ghost Stories. But anyway, that's my thoughts here. 4 out of 10 with that price tag. If the price came down, maybe that might bump it up to a 5. If anybody else out there has other experiences with this, let me know what you think. If uh if I'm just talking out my ass here, like go ahead, call me out down there in the comments cuz like I said, it has been years since I've had exposure to the Five Nights franchise and I have not played any of the Five Nights, but I feel like everybody has seen a whole bunch of the game theory. I'm that might actually be a good thing that I do tonight is rewatch a whole bunch of the Matt Pat Five Nights things just to kind of catch up on the lore and everything since I'm so far removed from the last several years of content. Overall, though, that is my impression of the store page. Since we are judging this game by the cover, the store page is leaving me like on the fence of even if I would want to look at this if it were to go on sale. And I mean, when I say on sale, I don't mean 10%. I mean like a good 60 70% at least before I would think to give this a glance.